All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. I want to start by thanking Speaker Kevin McCarthy. This committee would not exist were it not for Speaker McCarthy's vision, and Speaker McCarthy, along with Minority Leader Jeffrey, set the tone from the start of our work to make this a bipartisan effort, and we have done our best to keep it that way ever since. I think we've, occasionally Raj and I will disagree about something. That's always friendly, but we've succeeded thus far, and just wanted to thank you for your leadership. Congressman Costa is going to join us in a second. He has championed the people in his district when the issue of a clandestine biolab in Reedley came to light. Reedley City Manager Nicole Ziba, who led her city's response to the biolab, the Reedley Code Enforcement Officer Jesselyn Harper, who discovered the biolab, and of course, Colonel Robert Bob Cadlick, a renowned biosecurity expert with decades of experience dealing with issues that we'll be discussing today. So last year, Jesselyn Harper discovered a facility in Reedley storing samples of 20 infectious agents, including vials labeled tuberculosis and a freezer labeled Ebola. It was owned by a PRC national with ties to the PRC government-controlled entities, and a $330 million judgment outstanding against him for stealing U.S. intellectual property. Almost as troubling were the dial tones on the other end of the phone when local officials tried to raise concerns with various federal agencies about these deadly pathogens. So here is a summary of what we found in our investigation.
2022, Code Enforcement Officer Jesselyn Harper noticed a green garden hose sticking out of the side of a warehouse in the small town of Reedley, California. The hose was a clear violation of the city's building code, so Officer Harper showed her badge and entered the warehouse. Inside the vast, dimly lit building, she found laboratory equipment, manufacturing devices, dangerous chemicals, and medical-grade freezers and containment units holding thousands of vials of biological substances. Some of these vials were unlabeled. Some were labeled in Mandarin, others in a code that no one ever deciphered. Others were in English, with names of pathogens that Officer Parker did recognize, like HIV. The city also found approximately 1,000 transgenic mice used for research of human disease, which biolab workers told them were, quote, genetically engineered to catch and carry the COVID-19 virus. That discovery kicked off a 9-month effort by the city of Reedley to address the public health risk posed by the illegal, clandestine Reedley biolab, and to investigate what had happened at that facility, and what might have happened if Officer Harper had been less alert. Reedley city officials reached out to relevant law enforcement, public health, and regulatory officials about their shocking discovery. The FBI declined to investigate. The CDC refused to speak to them, and on multiple occasions hung up on local officials mid-conversation. Finally, frustrated, city officials turned to Representative Jim Costa, their local member of Congress. With Representative Costa's help, Reedley officials finally got the CDC on site. Based solely on reading the labels, the CDC identified at least 20 potentially infectious agents, including many in risk group 2 and 3. Per the CDC, pathogens in risk group 3 are serious or lethal human diseases. Despite the admitted risks, the CDC refused to test the samples or examine the unlabeled vials containing what appeared to be pathogens or other biological samples. City officials repeatedly requested and even offered to pay for the testing, but the CDC still refused. Bafflingly, the CDC then reached the conclusion that there was no evidence of select agents or toxins, and had state and local authorities destroy all the materials pursuant to court order. Subject to this court order, and based on the CDC's refusal to test the samples, city officials eradicated approximately 104 tons of general waste, including complex laboratory equipment, and 448 gallons of medical and biological waste. Along the way, local officials who had previously not thoroughly investigated several of the freezers for fear of encountering a dangerous pathogen made a shocking discovery. A freezer labeled Ebola, filled with sealed silver bags consistent with how the Reedley Biolab operators stored sensitive biological materials. Ebola has a 25 to 90% lethality rate. The CDC did not find this freezer in its search. When confronted with this fact over email, and the absence of Ebola noted in its report, the CDC still said it was not a concern unless the packages themselves were labeled Ebola and would not merit testing before destruction of the evidence. No one will ever know how many answers were destroyed based on the CDC's inaction. As the city remediated the illegal lab's public health risks, the Select Committee, at the direction of Speaker McCarthy and Congressman Jim Costa, worked with Reedley city officials and issued a subpoena that would allow local officials to provide Congress with documents and evidence. Our investigation revealed a complex connection between the Reedley Biolab's owner and founder, Jiabei Jesse Zhu, and the government of the People's Republic of China. Zhu previously stole millions of dollars of American intellectual property to directly benefit PRC-affiliated companies. Actions that, per his own admissions, were done to further PRC policy and to meet the city demands of the PRC premier. Zhu is a PRC citizen who served as a corporate officer on military-civil fusion organizations within the PRC and private organizations affiliated with or partially controlled by the PRC government. While in these roles, he traveled to Canada and formed dozens of companies there that engaged in massive theft of American intellectual property from a company, resulting in a $330 million Canadian court judgment against Zhu and his co-conspirators in 2016. In private messages on the Chinese application WeChat, Zhu claimed that his fraudulent scheme against the American company would help, quote, defeat the American aggressor and wild, ambitious wolf, and that while, quote, the law is strong, the outlaw is 10 times stronger. When Zhu failed to appear in court after the issuance of the judgment, a judge issued an arrest warrant for civil contempt of court. Zhu then appeared to have entered the U.S. illegally and operated under the false alias David He. Upon entering the United States, he set up a new network of biotech companies with the same PRC national board members, acquired thousands of vials of biological substances, pathogens, medical devices, and equipment found later at the clandestine Biolab site in Reedley. To incorporate and administer many of these companies, Zhu turned to an accountant tied to entities associated with the CCP's United Front Work Department. Meanwhile, under the auspices of these companies, Zhu purchased cheap or counterfeit test kits for COVID tests, pregnancy, ovulation, and nutritional deficiencies from the PRC, resold them to Americans as made in USA at a steep markup. None of these relatively straightforward fraudulent activities required the medical equipment, transgenic mice, pathogens, or other biological substances found at the Biolab. And keeping these materials were extremely expensive, requiring large warehouses and specialized equipment, including medical-grade freezers, to maintain. Meanwhile, while Zhu was inexplicably spending a small fortune on an unlicensed and illegal Biolab facility, he was also receiving large, unexplained money transfers from PRC bank accounts. More than $2 million of various transfers over a few years. These payments also cannot be explained by his fraudulent scheme, which requires Zhu to pay money to suppliers in China to obtain the counterfeit test kits he fraudulently resold to Americans. On October 18, 2023, federal agents of the Food and Drug Administration arrested Zhu pursuant to a federal criminal complaint. The complaint alleged that Zhu sold counterfeit or otherwise misbranded test kits and made false statements to federal agents. It is unclear whether federal officials are investigating the broader concerns raised by the pathogens found in the Reedley Biolab. That is what we know so far. Due to the intricacies of Zhu's PRC-based scheme and CDC's failure to test thousands of, quote, potentially infectious agents, we lack the ability to fully answer essential questions. Why would Zhu keep dangerous pathogens for years as a wanted man, despite the extreme cost and risk? How did he obtain apparent samples of the Ebola virus, one of the deadliest pathogens known to man? What were the nature of the large payments coming to Zhu from China? Perhaps more importantly, this investigation raises troubling questions about the state of our nation's biosecurity. How did a wanted man like Zhu operate clandestine biolabs in Reedley and other locations for years while avoiding detection? Why do present laws allow private, and in this case, wholly illegal laboratories, like the one in Reedley, to purchase deadly pathogens from American laboratories without scrutiny? How did the CDC and the federal government so fundamentally fail this local community? Why did the CDC refuse to test the pathogens before their court-ordered destruction? The investigation into Reedley Biolab shows that competent and driven local public servants like Jessalyn Harper and City Manager Nicole Ziba can do great things in the service of their community. It also shows, however, that our nation is fundamentally vulnerable to pathogenic risk. The investigation has revealed that there are no safeguards, no tripwires, no monitoring, the acquisition of deadly pathogens and materials that could clearly be used for extraordinarily dangerous bioweapon research here on American soil. This must change. Everyday Americans hearing this news will ask an entirely reasonable question. How many other clandestine laboratories exist in the United States? What disturbs the Select Committee is not necessarily that it does not know the answer to this question. It is that no one does. Due to deep institutional failures and a lack of basic safeguards, our nation lacks essential biosecurity out of a moment of competition with the Chinese Communist Party when we need it most. It is the goal of the Select Committee on a bipartisan basis and in coordination with other committees of jurisdiction to address this fundamental gap in our biosecurity and ensure that something like the Reedley Biolab never happens again. That is the outcome that America deserves. That is the outcome that we will achieve.
So that is a summary of the final report. I'll now recognize the ranking member for his comments and then the Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Speaker. Thank you to my colleagues. Thank you to Mr. Cadlick. Thank you to Mr. Costa, who worked with our local city officials in Reedley to bring this to our attention. And of course, thank you to our local officials who are here appearing remotely. I'll say two things that I took away from this investigation. One is that there's massive problems with our biosafety regulations where anybody, literally anybody, can purchase pathogens and on the internet. And so if that can happen, then we're all at risk. And then the second is we need to make sure that the CDC and other federal actors have the tools, the authorities they need to proactively make sure that something like this Reedley situation doesn't occur. And of course, when called upon, that we don't hear from local officials that their assistance wasn't rendered promptly. So those are my takeaways, and again, I thank all of you for your attention to this very important issue, and I turn it back to the chair.
The Speaker, and the reason the Select Committee exists, Kevin McCarthy.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for a number of reasons, just how they have carried out this committee, the character in which you do it and the way that you're able to make it bipartisan, taking a number of issues. I've been very, very impressed. It's exactly what I had hoped the committee to become. For more than 20 years, from the State House to Congress, I've represented the Central Valley, along with Jim Costa. And Reedley, California is just north of my district up in Fresno, California, where I grew up and where I live now. Shortly after the news broke, and to the local officials, thank you for what you've done. Thank you for actually paying attention. Had you not noticed it, this could have been continued to going on. And to reaching out, I want to thank Congressman Jim Costa for his role in helping. I want to thank the Select Committee to take up this investigation. And you'll find from this report, and Colonel, thank you, this is a very thorough report. And there's a lot of things that Congress should learn from this report. First and foremost, a few hard truths. The owner of the lab shouldn't even been in America. He was here illegally. He had a judgment, as you watched in this report, from stealing IP from Canada and America for more than $330 million, living under a false name, and illegally providing this lab. But something that the ranking member brought up, unbeknownst to many of us, and we are lawmakers, how easy it is to get such serious pathogens to be able to purchase them online. And what we have found through this investigation, the millions of dollars running from China to this facility. The purchasing of test kits that we found do not work, but making made in America and selling them in America to Americans, giving them false hope, false understanding when it comes to health and others. And then the greatest concern that I have when you look at on the samples of the pathogens from HIV, meningitis, Ebola sitting there, the failure when it comes to the CDC. Congress should not have had to get involved here. The local representatives did exactly what was right. They reached out to the federal authorities that should deal with this. The CDC and others hung up on them, ignored them, until the Congressman Jim Costa called them. But when the CDC showed up, they should have done what was right then, and they did not. They did not test the pathogens. They did not even find all of them. They left a freezer with Ebola in it, and we know how lethal that is and what could happen, especially in the Central Valley. Watching what is going on in this lab, the testing and the mice dealing with COVID and others, we still don't have the clear understanding. And it wasn't until the select committee here got involved, did the owner get arrested? Did we find out that the CDC finally would get involved? But in all these findings, what I think really comes forth is we need to produce legislation to change this. We need safeguards on these pathogens. It should not be so freely be able to purchase on the internet. How deadly that could be to the rest of this country. How many more labs are like this throughout America? Is China involved in other labs inside America? Is China involved with pathogens inside America as well? I mean, it was just the luck of a local authority moving through on seeing something that didn't seem right. This lab had been moved before. There had been fires and indication, and if it wasn't for the local authorities of them picking up on it, we would have never known. But the deadliness that this could have caused, not just in the Central Valley, but spread throughout our country, is a real concern. I do want to commend not just this committee, but I also want to commend Fresno County and the city of Reedley to their swift action responding to this threat in the months prior. I do want to thank for the ongoing cooperation with the Select Committee investigation and the speed in which you were able to do this investigation. That to me is very impressive, and the thoroughness of what you've been able to do here. Now, we've uncovered the fatal flaws in our system, and we must continue to work on legislative solutions until we can get a say of the full confidence that this will never happen again. So what I'm looking forward to is the advancement of legislation to bring us the safeguards we need and the continuing further investigation to really get to the bottom of what China was doing inside America, moving millions of dollars and deadly pathogens just before our own nose that we did not know. And we need the safeguards and the credibility back to the CDC that we shouldn't have to be involved to get them involved, but more importantly, they did not do their job. And I think they need new guidelines in the process to make sure their job's done and new accountability at the CDC. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Speaker McCarthy. Before I recognize Representative Costa, a logistical note, a little before 5, the ranking member and I will have to step out for a few minutes. We will come back shortly thereafter, but we're just going to keep going through the run of show, which will be Representative Costa, then we'll hear from our local officials, then we'll hear from Colonel Cadlick, and then we'll hear from the members for either a statement or questions. The Speaker, of course, is in charge for as long as he wants to stay. That remains true.
I got no committees.
Yeah, that's right. But we'll operate under just grown-up rules here. So thank you to Representative Costa for being a leader on this issue, for working with our committee, and with that, I recognize Representative Costa.
Thank you very much, Chairman Mike Gallagher and Ranking Member Raja Krishnamurthy.
Raja. Yes.
Raja. Works better that way. And Speaker Emeritus Kevin McCarthy, who I've worked with for many years, and the members of this select committee, because I think what you're learning is that we had a very serious problem in the city of Reedley, California, that I proudly represent. It's like a lot of cities throughout our country. 25,000 people. It's been a source of pride by the Reedley Community College and the incredible agriculture that surrounds this community, like so many of our farm communities that Kevin and I represent. And the world's changed, and we know that China is an adversary, they're a competitor, and they're a vast market. And that makes it complicated. And we are concerned in this day and age when we have challenges in the Middle East and Ukraine and with China about infiltrating our intelligence systems, artificial intelligence, our banking, our utilities, and after the pandemic that really shook the entire world we live in, and lessons to be learned under categories, you think about infectious diseases and you think about the control of them, and we were thinking about how the COVID, really came out of China, and a lot of questions that are there in lie, that we would allow a Chinese nationalist to come to this country and to set up a private lab. And what we found is that all it takes to set up a private lab in America is to get a business license. And in the community that you're attempting to establish this laboratory. I think the Speaker Metris gave you a bit of the story because he and I share important parts of our valley, and we work together. But the city of Reedley, its Mayor Betancourt, and its city manager Nicole Ziba, and the city council that are participating in this press conference had a dilemma on their hands, and they were attempting, after discovering this lab had been set up, and if it wasn't for a observant city employee who was just checking to make sure that things were appropriate, they found a pipe out of this warehouse that was discharging effluent, and that city employee thought, well, that's not right. And they looked into it, and all of a sudden they found out, lo and behold, that there were approximately 1,000 laboratory mice that were in this lab, and there were all sorts of other infectious diseases that included hepatitis, included HIV, included COVID, enough to scare the bejesus out of anyone. And trying to get the appropriate attention, and after frustration on the city's part, they contacted our office in March. We went to work immediately on behalf of the city, got the county involved. I thank that Jessalyn Harper and the other public health officials for Fresno County, Joe Prada and David Lucchini, got engaged, and we then got the federal agencies and the state to focus, from the CDC to the FDA to the FBI, the IRS, the USCIS, and the EPA, to thoroughly investigate and release a report of their findings. The report that you have before you really reflects what they discovered and recommendations on how we can prevent this from happening again in other communities throughout our country. I think the local health officials, once they were engaged, did a good job in opening the investigation. My priority from day one, the first time I was made aware of this, is what? Health and public safety. Health and public safety. There was a bit of a kerfuffle as it went on for a few months with some of the locals wanting to kind of politicize this up, but I reached out to Speaker McCarthy, and I want to thank him for his engagement in this. We wrote a letter that we co-signed, and we also looked into, believe it or not, this private lab was able to apply for and receive funds from the Payroll Protection Program. We looked about, well, was that appropriate? And so the Select Committee on Chinese Communist Party, I think, has put together a bipartisan report that outlines the gaps, and these are gaps that we should all be concerned about. I mean, if a country was threatening us, like China, what better way to create havoc than to be able to spread through private labs all sorts of infectious diseases? I mean, we saw how unprepared we were to deal with the COVID. My gosh, What if this was a deliberately planned attempt to really, impact our country and our communities? Obviously, the city of Reedley became very concerned, and the citizens, had to be reassured by the city. They were up in arms. They wanted to know, was their health being compromised? Were their children's health being compromised? Were their schools being impacted? And so I think that every member on a bipartisan basis is committed to closing the gaps. I'm looking for the Select Committee to make recommendations on legislation, bipartisan legislation that we could go forward with so that our local communities cannot be exploited by bad actors. This individual, by the way, came from Canada, came here illegally from Canada, had a history of doing these kind of private labs, set one up in Nevada, originally had one in Fresno, had some code violation problems in Fresno, the city of Fresno, so then he went 20 miles southeast to Reedley and established it. I mean, the whole time only applying for a business license. So finally, the federal agencies, after conducting their own investigation, have resulted in an arrest of this individual. Oh, by the way, before he was arrested, he sued the city of Fresno and sued, I think, the state, which is strange, but how he could come up with the millions of dollars to even establish these labs and trailing the money, I think is something that we need to be more aware of. So I, again, want to close by thanking this committee, the Select Committee, for their efforts to work together on a bipartisan basis, the recommendations in their report. I think we need to proceed from here because every community in America should be protected from health and safety purposes as it relates to labs, whether they be a private lab or whether they be a public lab. The fact of the matter is these labs can contain some highly infectious diseases, as we've learned, and the whole purpose, ostensibly for the purpose of this lab, was to provide medical test kits for COVID, medical test kits for pregnancy. I mean, and none of these medical test kits ever really proved to be valid medical test kits, but that was the shield that this operator was attempting to mask whatever the real purpose was. I don't think we clearly know today. And so therefore we need to continue to work on this for all the right reasons. And I want to, again, thank everyone at the local level, again, the city of Reedley, the manager, the mayor, the city council members, the Fresno County public health officials, and my colleagues around this dais for, I think, good work. And now we'll look at trying to implement recommendations that will protect cities like Reedley and communities across our country. Thank you.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him for his work throughout the valley. Now let's turn to our local officials, Reedley City Manager. I believe we have the Code Enforcement Officer as well. Turn it over to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Good afternoon. Honorable Congress members, I am beyond grateful to this committee for taking a serious look at the illegal biolab situation that's occurred in our town in Reedley, California. This lab was discovered because an observant code enforcement officer noticed something strange, a green garden hose drilled into the back of the wall where it shouldn't be. And from there, the discovery led to over 30 fridges and sub-zero freezers with infectious diseases, unmarked and purposefully mismarked dangerous laboratory chemicals, hundreds of thousands of recalled medical test kits, and around 1,000 white lab mice genetically modified to catch and carry COVID for testing purposes. This was a true house of horrors, nestled next to an elementary school, a supermarket, a city hall, and a public water system. Every elected official in this country should be concerned about whether an illicit lab with dangerous infectious substances could be hiding in their community. Undoubtedly, there are more in this country. Could this have been prevented in Reedley with appropriate legislation? The answer for me is yes. And this is our legacy moment, a purely nonpartisan moment to make changes to decades-old laws, regulations, and protocols that will make this country safer for us and for our children. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to Congressman Costa. Without his swift intervention, Reedley would still be crying out for help, banging on doors, trying to get someone's attention. But perhaps this is where my thanks turns to opening the conversation to some serious legal loopholes and protocol issues that have been in some ways as shocking as the lab itself. You see, this company, Prestige Biotech, Universal Meditech, ADE, AIDE, whatever it wanted to call itself at the time, this company has been allowed to exist and commit fraud for a decade. As you mentioned, they fled Canada after legal prosecution. They were able to come to America, purchase properties. They were in and out of Fresno, in and out of Tulare, all over, and under the cover of night came to my little city of Reedley. And as I sit here in front of you today, I'm proud of this little city for not turning a blind eye and simply kicking them out to go elsewhere. We may be small, but this little David city finally took down the Goliath, not with a slingshot, but with a green garden hose. In my 25 years of local government management, I never would have imagined I would have to deal with this. There is no manual to pull off the shelf to follow, but I've learned some critical things in this complex investigation. Among them, private research and development labs that are purely privately funded are exempt from the federal regulations that provide a safety and accountability framework. This is known as CLIA. You'll hear about that. Also, we learned that labs can import infectious diseases from foreign countries. It requires a permit, but then that permit is not tracked, and those substances can be legally sold and transferred to other companies. Federal departments have little to no tracking mechanisms for them, we have been told. No tripwires to catch this. We've also learned that according to the CDC, their legal authority to test potentially infectious substances is limited and puts this nation at great immediate risk. The CDC's report claims that while over 20 infectious agents were found in Reedley, no select agents were found. Select agents, as you know, are the worst of the worst, like anthrax and smallpox, and only the ones that would have yielded a prosecutable offense for possession. I specifically asked why the CDC refused to test any of the vials found in the sub-zero freezer, and particularly the vials that did not have labels on them. Their direct response to me was that the CDC does not have authority to test things without a label. Well, let me tell you, if that's an accurate statement, it's terrifying. We've just told bioterrorists how to get away with having select agents, and that's to simply rip the label off a vial. If it was not accurate, though, it's deeply dismaying that our city was misled when pleading for assistance. And hearkening back to my thanks to Congressman Costa, we learned through this process that there is no single agency to call for assistance in such a complex case. It fell to this little city of Reedley and the Fresno County Public Health Department to coordinate and lead efforts of over 30 different individuals in over 10 different state and federal agencies, none of which have authority to step into any other agency's realm and lead abatement and investigation efforts. Complex, confounding. And again, this mighty little city of Reedley took the lead. But what if the next Prestige Biolab isn't in a city that takes the bull by the horns? Where does it go next, and how bad does it have to get? While we sit here with one another, Zhu, the lab CEO, is sitting in custody facing federal charges for misbranding medical devices. The fact that he's in custody is a great thing, but it's disheartening that he faces no prosecution or other legal action for storing deadly pathogens next to an elementary school and a public water system in the middle of a very small agricultural town. We can fix many of the issues that led to the Reedley Biolab. This can be our legacy moment, and I thank each one of you for that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You raised some very good points. You shouldn't have had to go to your congressman. CDC should have responded, but it's just eye-opening that this could be in the valley, that they could have these type of pathogens sitting inside. But thank you for finding just a garden hose to discover all this. You've made the valley much safer. Let's turn to our biosecurity expert, Colonel.
Well, thank you very much, former Speaker McCarthy. I'm sorry. I'm a little froggy. I have a bit of an upper respiratory infection. I swear I'm not infectious, so don't worry, at least for those people over there. But first of all, I thank you for the opportunity, and I just want to acknowledge our colleagues from the state and local authorities that I think have done an amazing job in what I've reviewed, both in public record as well as this report, as well as court proceedings. Clearly, the inspector who was astute to see that green hose it deserves a lot of credit in terms of highlighting what I think is a critical gap in our biosecurity posture going forward, as well as what we've had for the last 20 years. I would just remind people, and again, I'm in the vintage where I spent 26 years in the military. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, and clearly after the anthrax letter attacks was involved in the response to assist both CDC and the FBI in responding to those events that occurred in the Senate. I would just point out to you that that was not my only involvement in these kinds of activities. I served as a UN inspector in Iraq during the 90s, as well as a member of the Department of Defense's representation to the Biological Weapons Convention, and then in 2003 and 4 was involved in weapons inspections in Iraq following our Iraqi freedom operations. And I also served as Deputy Staff Director of the Senate Intelligence Committee, conducting a field investigation of ISIS chemical and biological activities in 2017. So I come to this with some element of experience, field experience, and am a medical epidemiologist, so I understand, if you will, some of the public health culture. I would just want to reaffirm a couple of the critical facts here that just lend itself to the idea of flashing yellow and red lights as to what transpired during the course of events here. One is the gentleman who ran this company or these companies, Jesse Zhu, and the fact that he was operating under alias in the United States, clearly was wanted in Canada, was clearly involved in intellectual property theft and whatever else he was doing while he was in Canada. And certainly his time in the United States really reflected a series of what I'd say seriously, just curious, if not questionable activities, such as reselling fraudulent Chinese diagnostic tests. He clearly had an infrastructure that he could have used for that purpose, but it was not put for that purpose. And that is one question that I think deserves consideration, and obviously, hopefully, will be a follow-up interest to this committee as well as to the American public. The second gap that I would say is that even though the obvious thing is that CDC came in and evaluated this laboratory, please remember that they're a public health agency, not an enforcement or regulatory agency, and they operate under certain guidelines that have historically kind of put them in less of a position of responsibility, but more of counseling or guiding or recommending activities. If you go to the Federal Select Agent Program report from 2021, they outline the kinds of activities and the rules of engagement that they use. And I'll just read you an example of them just so you get a flavor for what they do. Amongst the many activities they do, they investigate any incidents in which non-compliance may have occurred, and that's non-compliance with laboratories and activities and entities that register as a select agent activity. So unless you register as a select agent activity, they may not necessarily have known that you were not involved in that program. And in this case, when they come and review your compliance, they basically look at the registration, including the laboratory spaces, note not samples, and review documents, plans, records, and facility verification of documentation. So their role is really reviewing the paperwork in these laboratories, not actually evaluating. They have a critical role, however, and that is when they do find something that is out of sorts, they're obligated to inform and notify the FBI of any security-related issue identified by the Federal Select Agent Program, and which may be an unapproved individual having access to an agent of concern, security breach of the storage area, or any loss of a Select Agent. And it's really up to the FBI to investigate the incident. So if it is the circumstance that the CDC arrives at a place and reviews a list of agents that are there and identify them as non-select agents, they've done their job according to the rules they are currently living under. Obviously, that is not acceptable, and that's certainly not appropriate in the circumstance we find ourselves in today. And I think the key thing here is if there is a requirement to do future legislation, it is really a major task for Congress to consider that the federal select agent program does not just include human pathogens, but also animal pathogens, as well as agricultural pathogens, all of things that could affect not only human life, but our economic well-being and our food supplies. So these are all critically interconnected as we look at this. The last thing I'll just say to you is that many of the pieces exist today to address this problem. After 9/11, the FBI and the Epidemiological Investigative Service, an arm of the CDC, got together and actually worked to create a handbook for the event when there would be a disease outbreak that may be associated with accidental or deliberate use of a biological or select agent. That has been transcribed, and the latest edition is from 2018, and so it was recognized that these two entities needed to be worked together. And I think it's a case here, too, that kind of work needs to be done to really evaluate what we're dealing with now and in the future, which are not just simply research lab, but commercial laboratories that obviously could be performing some illicit or unlicensed activity, unregistered activity, and it's vital for the country to be able to monitor, to identify and investigate these things seamlessly with both the public health arm, working with the state and local authorities, as well as the law enforcement agencies to do this role. I'll be happy to take any questions going forward, but again, I appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of these issues, and again, acknowledge our colleagues in California for the great job they did.
Thank you, Colonel Cadlick. My understanding is that Jessalyn Harper has not spoken yet, and I believe she's the reason we're here, in that she discovered the thing in the first place. So I'll now recognize Ms. Harper.
Thank you for the opportunity for me to share my experiences through this ordeal with you. On December 2022, during what I believed would be a typical inspection, I unknowingly opened Pandora's box. Inside a warehouse, I walked past centrifuge machines, biosafety cabinets used to contain infectious agents, a plywood room housing almost 1,000 lab mice, and over 30 freezers and refrigerators containing approximately 20 infectious viruses, parasites, and bacteria. I also found thousands of illegal pregnancy and COVID-19 tests not approved for use, but still being shipped out to unsuspecting consumers. Finally, on March 2023, armed with only an inspection warrant, code enforcement entered the building again and was accompanied by California Public Health, California Department of Toxic Substance Control, and Fresno County Environmental Health. After inspecting and speaking with a self-proclaimed consultant of Prestige Biotech, each agency handed out business cards, tipped their hats, and left the warehouse with very little or no enforcement actions taken. I was left alone in a warehouse with no resources or direction on how to handle an illegal biosafety lab. Our city was faced with a decision. Do we keep the electricity on and risk a fire that could result in a mass evacuation, including our police department, city hall, high school, school district main office, and dozens of residential homes? Or do we cut the power, risking the potentially infectious agents in the freezers, defrosting, and possibly unleashing another pandemic into our community? We chose to keep the power on, deciding to potentially brave a fire rather than unleash an unknown terror on the city. On May 2023, we finally were able to arrange agencies with proper knowledge and resources to inspect the warehouse again. The inspection included the FDA, the CDC, and the California and Fresno County Public Health. The City of Reedley and the Fresno County Public Health Department requested for the CDC to collect samples of the unlabeled frozen samples and identify them. The CDC denied this request. The CDC identified 20 infectious agents only because they were adequately labeled. These items included tuberculosis, pneumonia, SARS-CoV-2, HIV, and malaria. During the July 2023 abatement for biohazardous waste, the abatement team found a freezer with a folded piece of paper on the door that read Ebola. Inside were silver-sealed bags, consistent with how the Reedley Biolab operators stored sensitive biological and other materials. I emailed the CDC about this development. The CDC officials stated that the CDC only tests when the samples themselves are labeled as Ebola. With no ability to test the samples, code enforcement was advised to move forward with the abatement. It has been almost a year since the discovery of the illegal lab, and we are still working to remove the chemicals and illegal medical devices on site. The operators of this business showed nothing short of blatant disregard for public safety. It is only a matter of time before items, such as the ones found in the Reedley lab, could fall into the wrong hands, and the response to the Reedley incident shows how unprepared we are as a nation.
Thank you, Ms. Harper, and just thank you for the way in which you've cooperated with the committee. We're now going to entertain a round of questions, and I know Mr. Costa has a limited time with us, and given that this is his district, I wanted to ask Mr. Costa if he has any questions, either for Colonel Cadlick or for the local officials.
Well, I certainly would be prepared to take any questions by the press, but I would like, through the chair, to ask you and members of the select committee on, after the preliminary efforts of the staff and the committee to put together this report, and again, I thank you for these efforts.
A report which has a great preface written by Jim Costa. So.
Well, it's a true story, like the report. And thank you for those kind words. But I think the process that the city of Reedley and the officials that did, I think, a terrific job in trying to do their efforts to protect the community and potentially other impacts. What is the way you think we can best go forward with legislation that would provide the sort of oversight for private labs and you know, as the Colonel indicated, responsibility in this area seems to be vague at best, and there doesn't seem to be a single agency at the federal level or at the state level, frankly, that coordinates this. Now, all of us represent counties throughout the country that have public health officers, and it ended up, in this case, the public health officer for the county of Fresno was the appropriate body that got engaged, and they worked closely with the city manager, Ziba, who did a terrific job representing her staff and her city council. But there was a kerfuffle of local politics, as you might imagine, because everybody got very concerned.
Yeah.
So we need to figure out how we can prevent these kinds of incidences, whether this was a rogue actor or what his ultimate intentions were. I hope we find out. But clearly, it sets it tells everyone out there that if we continue with the status quo, we could have a whole lot of problems on our hands.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think what makes sense to me is now that we have the report finalized, which, you know, it's a page turner. You should read it. Don't just read Costa's introduction. You got to read the whole thing. We can then identify some sensible next steps in terms of policy, put it into a broader set of efforts we want to do on the committee, examining biosecurity and synthetic biotech competition with China, and then hopefully release a policy report that then would spur the committees of jurisdiction to action. So I look forward to working with you. We're lucky to have some real expertise on the committee, particularly Dr. Dunn. And I want to now recognize the members for either a statement or a question, starting with Representative Newhouse.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, and thank you to our witnesses and ladies from California. Thanks for joining us. Gosh, I think maybe I hope this is a true statement, that we've really dodged a bullet here. perhaps. At least I know of no cases of humans being sickened or dying because of any of the actions that were taken by this individual. I hope that's the case, and we may learn more in days to come. But it certainly has, because of your quick action and your I guess I can say persistence in making sure somebody hears you. So thank you for that. We've certainly been able to see the weaknesses and the gaps in the system that exist. I think Dr. Cadlick has mentioned some of those things. We truly are in a vulnerable position, in my estimation. The statement's been made several times. How many of these labs exist throughout the country? We don't know that. There could be more Reedley, Californias around the country. Situations just going on even as we speak. So thank you very much for that. I've got a million questions that I don't have time for, Mr. Chairman, but I think it behooves us as a committee to look deeply into this, see where those gaps exist and where we need to tighten up the protocols that exist. And Dr. Kedlock, we could certainly use your assistance in doing that. What are the checklists that need to be followed on an investigation such as this? Obviously, there's huge discrepancies in what people believe they should be and what they are. Leaving Ms. Harper all by herself with this warehouse full of many dangerous materials, that's just unconscionable for not only her safety, but the safety of the community. In my former life, I was the Director of Agriculture for the state of Washington, and many times I felt like the little Dutch boy with my fingers in the dike trying to keep all these bad things at bay, and one of them was exactly what you mentioned, the pathogens that could make our agricultural industry susceptible. So that piqued my interest for sure, that not only are we talking about individual health, but also our food supply is at risk with this kind of activities that could be going on. And just one's imagination can truly take off on thinking about all of the things that could occur if we don't get a handle on this. So Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for giving us some time here. Mr. Costa, thanks for your diligence on helping to expose this, and we truly do have to respond. It's our obligation, our responsibility to make sure that we can help keep the American people safe in uncovering and fixing these kinds of situations.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Newhouse. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To say that I'm disturbed by these revelations here is a severe understatement. I work personally at a BSL-4 laboratory at Fort Detrick, the military's chemical biological warfare headquarters, and I have to tell you, I'm just floored by the lack of response at CDC. I think it's nothing less than malfeasance. But for the diligence of Officer Jesslyn Harper, this lab would probably still be operating today. So I want you to know, Ms. Harper, you're a hero. We admire you, we thank you, your nation thanks you, and I'm sure the city of Reedley really thanks you because you've just done a great service for us all. My attention in this lab was really galvanized by the presence of 1,000 humanized lab mice. Now, I want to explain what that is to people who don't know what a humanized mouse is. It's been genetically modified to mimic a human immune system so that you can test it for your infectious nature in human beings. That's what it is. There is no reason to run these mice except to either create a biological warfare instrument or to defend against one. So this had nothing to do with the ostensible purpose of this warehouse where they're selling tests for the Lord. And I'd like to draw your attention to a poster. Do we have the poster, Pete? Thank you. You take a look at the things you see on this poster, wherever it is. You don't have to be a doctor to figure out that these things, this is a dangerous situation. It's dangerous on all sides size of it. It's this is a complete lack of response by the CDC is mind-boggling. They tested no samples, so none of this has been verified by DNA sequencing or simple mass spec testing. I mean, there's lots of ways you can run this thing, and they didn't get off their desk chair to do one thing. So I thank you again, Ms. Harper. But Dr. Cadlick, always good to see you. Dr. Cadlick is a renowned authority on biological warfare and dangerous pathogens, and I always am smarter when he comes in and when he leaves. You've been terrific to work with. Thank you very much. Dr. Cadlick, I'd like you to speak to the risks inherent in a laboratory. I'm calling it a lab generously, a laboratory such as the one found in Reedley, and what you think the federal response should have been, not the laws we need to create. Yes, we do need to create laws, but what the response maybe should have been.
Well, one thing that is apparent, and just kind of familiarizing myself with the standard techniques and practices that were used to, if you will, enforce the select agent program, it's really a paper drill, number one. So I think right there is when you look at least from the historical record, that an average select agent program inspection takes about 3 days to complete at a given facility, a registered facility. That's the time it took for the CDC to go through this facility. I think you heard from the officer that the holdings of that laboratory were pretty extensive, more than 30 freezers, refrigerators, some marked, some not marked, a variety of different biological and chemical materials that were in there, certainly some of them very hazardous in terms of their explosive and fire potential. But clearly the thing that, it kind of strikes me the most is that in the course of events, the due diligence to actually evaluate what was in each refrigerator or evaluate each refrigerator, it sounded like the officer was the only one who decided to look at that piece of paper on the refrigerator and pull it out and say, oh, it says Ebola on it, which to me is pretty astounding. And I think that's one thing that for people to do these kinds of investigations, they have to be trained. Again, we live in a different era now where obviously we went through 9/11. We certainly are looking into the cusp of the biotechnology age and synthetic biology where people have do-it-yourself labs all over the place. So the possibility that, like you said, there are many of these labs in our country that we don't know exist is really something that has to be kind of put in the forefront of saying, how can we deal with this and how can you legislate in a way that is thoughtful, on one hand, to capture those laboratories that are not registered or licensed, like this particular one, but also not to impede the science, the good science that has to be done going forward. You ask about the hazards that are associated with these laboratories. Clearly, the hazard is to people like the officer or people who are doing the abatement when they don't know what they're getting into. And that is one of the things that clearly with the identification of a possible Ebola sample, and I would just point out to you that Ebola in the United States is not an endemic disease. It only resides in BSL-4 labs that are highly secure and have very exquisite safety activities. It's not, present in many places else in this hemisphere, like Canada, except in the same places. And even in China, Ebola doesn't exist as an endemic disease. So the question comes down to, that would have been the cue, I think, to really kind of change the nature of the investigation and maybe stop the abatement and actually evaluate what were in those tubes, because to your point, that is a risk to both the first responder and to the community if you don't know what's in them. And I think that that's something that if there's a lesson learned, that would have been an appropriate time for at least the CDC to make notifications to the Bureau that there may be a select agent in this grouping, and there is a mechanism by which not the CDC, but the Department of Homeland Security would perform the tests up at Fort Detrick at the National Biodefense Countermeasure Center that exists to support the FBI to do this kind of forensic examination both safely and completely. And so that was just a missed opportunity opportunity, I think. But to the future, I think it does take a kind of, let's look at a clean sheet of paper and take a look at what we need to do going forward, recognizing the threat and recognizing what capabilities exist already.
So I do want to be clear. You believe, I believe, certainly we did used to have the capacity, the ability, the wherewithal to do a mobile response to an infected site, to, gather the samples safely, and analyze them safely, and then, gear up for a real whole of government plan. Do we still have that ability?
Well, we have it for certain scenarios, as I mentioned, the outbreak scenario where someone gets sick. But that's not the case here, and that protocol wasn't employed for this. It was a different part of CDC that worked with the FBI to do that piece of it.
So we should have infected somebody, and then we got a more robust response.
That would have been the tripwire to use the appropriate protocol.
It's kind of like you find a bomb and you say, if it didn't go off, we're not going to investigate it, right? Doesn't it bother you? Well, thank you very much, Dr. Caddick. Thank you, Officer Harper, and
thank you, Dr. Dunn, for your expertise and engagement on these issues. I know we want to answer questions from the press. A few quick questions for Dr. Cadlick and the local officials. I guess just based on what we have in our report in terms of what was discovered at the lab, if Mr. Hsu wanted to weaponize the contents of the lab, give us a sense of the scale of destruction that could have caused.
Well, it's hard to understand in terms of the scale of it, but, again, the mice are an interesting kind of, a side story because they themselves represent a bioincubator.
Yeah.
If you were to inject them with some of these agents, they certainly, because they're humanized, could reproduce it, and you could actually recover the organs and plasma from the mice that could be used for something. 1,000 mice, I don't know what that scales up to in terms of how much material you could do, but certainly you could create a lot of havoc, a lot of concern, and whether that was in the cards or not, it certainly is one of the odd things that I just noted to myself, as I say, curious but concerning.
Yeah.
Which is he's importing these tests, he's repackaging them and selling them. They're fraudulent tests. They're not very effective. The FDA comes in and shuts that down, but he has this overhead or this incredible logistical tail that gives him much more capability that, at least from what was described, was not being used at the moment.
Yeah.
And the question was it used before? And if it wasn't, that even only adds to the mystery of this.
Sure. And then for Ms. Sieben and Harper, just give me a sense of what, the residents of Reedley, what was their reaction to this at the time and now? Give us a sense of what, on the ground among the local populace.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. And I'm glad that we are really paying attention to what the community felt, because there really was a sense of terror, I would say, when this first was uncovered. Now, by the time the public learned about this, we had abated the infectious disease freezers. So we were able to tell the public that any infectious diseases that had been in that lab were gone. And we had to use a BSL-4 level cleanup because we did not know what was in this lab. So we used an extremely thorough process. Our public is still very concerned, and when we as public officials go out and say that our nation's laws and regulations still would allow something like this to occur yet again, they're obviously very concerned. This, as I mentioned in my statement, was next to an elementary school, a public water system. It was next to a supermarket, a city hall. This really could be anywhere in America right now. So I think I'm glad that you are concerned about how the public view this in Reedley, because the Reedley public is the American public, and they were very traumatized, very concerned.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions from the press? Yes, ma'am. There was no intentionality to overlap with the Biden-Xi meeting. In fact, I'm not naive enough to suggest that even a hearing this exciting would get more media attention than the Biden-Xi APEC summit. So don't read anything into that other than this was the time when we could do it, and there aren't too many legislative days left in the calendar year 2023. So.
Mr. Chairman, I do have to go, but let me thank you once again and the committee and Speaker McCarthy for your cooperation and collaboration. As I said before, the city of Reedley, its officers, its city manager, its inspector, and its city council were terrific, and I think they're a good example of what conscientious, elected officials at the local level and the staff that serve them do when they do their job well, and they did do their job well, and they're to be commended, congratulated, and I thank them.
Thank you, Representative Costa, and to your team. You were very easy to work with. We appreciate that very much. Thank you, sir. Other questions? Sir.
Hi, Joe Khalil with News Nation. Sorry if I missed this, but we heard Speaker McCarthy talk about how there do need to be some solutions put forward legislatively to try to prevent something like this from happening in other jurisdictions and other places. Just wondering if there's anything that you can say in terms of discussions about specifics. Are there, anything in the pipeline that you could foresee that would help to mitigate something like this going forward?
Well, I just want to state at the outset that the report we released is not a policy report per se. It was just intended to lay out the facts of the case, not to make inferences, projections, or even recommendations about the policy going forward, just to lay out the facts. But our goal here today was to stimulate a discussion about potential solutions going forward that so we never have this happen again, or at a minimum, when a local official calls the CDC, they pick up the phone. I think we've heard from Colonel Cadlick already in terms of some constructive steps going forward. I would put them into a couple broad categories, and then I would invite my colleagues to comment if they'd like to. One is to ensure better responsiveness from the federal agencies who already have the duty to respond to these incidents. We don't expect the CDC to be the FBI or DHS or an IC agency, but we do expect them to respond when local officials call for help. If there's a set of greater authorities or resources they need in order to do that, I'm open to that discussion. If we need to foster better communication between the CDC and the relevant IC agencies who would have a sophisticated understanding of a PRC national who came here illegally with dubious ties to various Chinese entities, I'm open to that discussion as well. And I do think, as someone who focuses a lot on national security and intelligence issues, it's my observation. I'm speaking outside the report here. I'm not pretending that this is a bipartisan, unanimous assessment of the committee. But I don't think, even in the intelligence community, we have a sophisticated enough understanding of what the CCP is doing here domestically, particularly through United Front work we've already seen things like illegal police stations on American soil, theft of seeds in Iowa. This is happening across the board, and so there's a variety of things we could do to better equip our intelligence professionals to help us understand that. Any comments from my colleagues?
I think you've said it very well. Honestly, we have ability. Now we have to establish responsibility and authority to follow up on things like this. We can't let these things fall through the cracks, especially against the backdrop of the fact that we know China admittedly has biological warfare capability, which we no longer practice, but we need to practice defense, and we aren't.
Yeah, and then Colonel Cadlick, did you have to summarize a lot of what you said? What in your opinion, what are the slam dunk, easy? Nothing's easy in DC, but the steps going forward that you think would have bipartisan support here on the Hill?
Well, I think that the thing is this has been the wake-up call, and I think for people who've experienced the pandemic to realize that you can start a mini pandemic as a consequence of an unregistered lab doing who knows what. I think there are three things that kind of come to mind. Is who's in charge? I think it was Representative Costa who said, is it appropriate for CDC to kind of be in charge for these things, or is there some other federal agency that would have the authorities for both not only monitoring but enforcement? The second thing is what are the capabilities that exist in the U.S. government that need to be mobilized for this purpose? And more importantly, I think the third thing is working with both the private sector in the sense of the commercial side, but also the research side to find out, because they're part of the solution to how to figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't impede our ability to be competitive against China in biotechnology. And so I think it's that fusion of those three, what I'd say, themes, and then building particulars. There have been reports that have been done by the National Biosecurity Advisory Board that's part of NIH. When I served in HHS, there was the P3CO that looked at oversight of research, particularly gain-of-function research. But all these things somehow have to be fused into some single clearinghouse so that no matter who does it, whether it's an agricultural activity or a human activity, that we have the same rules, the same kind of mechanism to ensure that it's done ethically, safely, and securely.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Any other comments from our local officials from Reedley who were kind enough to join us?
We just can't thank you enough for taking this issue seriously. We feel heard finally after so many months, and so we really appreciate your resources that you've put towards this. Your staff has been amazing, so thank you.
Thank you both very much for working with us. Thank you again to Colonel Cadlick. Thanks to the members of the committee, to the ranking member, former Speaker McCarthy. And again, our goal is to prevent something like this from ever happening again here in America. And so we hope that you'll read the report, and we look forward to continuing this conversation on the Select Committee. Thank you.